All right, let's jump right in. Queen's Gambit accepted. 1 d4, d5, c4, d takes c4. Having read the two previous chapters and noticed the multitude of variations where black plays d takes c4 at some point, the reader may have started wondering whether it is not much simpler to take on c4 straight away. And the answer is a very simple yes. It is much simpler. By playing d takes c4, black defines the outlines of the middle game. White will have to regain the pawn, which gives black time to attack in the center, usually with c5 or e5. But whether it is a good idea to make this decision so early in the game is another matter. In fact, this question is almost impossible to answer in a general way. It is very much a matter of choosing a type of middle game. Are there positions that you prefer or that you wish to avoid? This is, of course, a very personal matter. By playing the Queen's Gambit accepted, black really turned the logic of most of the d takes c4 variations of the previous two chapters around. Instead of developing his pieces first, and waiting for a suitable moment to capture on c4, he takes on c4 first and then adapts his development to the setup chosen by white for recapturing the pawn. White now has to make up his mind. He may want to go all out in the center by playing e4, or he may prefer to adopt a more flexible attitude and play 3 knight to f3. Now, two other moves, e3 and knight to c3, were considered less accurate for a very long time because they allow bold response 3 e5. The position after, say, e3, e5, d takes e5, queen takes d1 check, king takes d1, bishop e6 is indeed fine for black. But recent practice has shown that white can do much better with bishop takes c4 exclamation point, e takes d4, e takes d4. Or the other option, knight c3, e5, e3 exclamation point, e takes d4, e takes d4. When in both cases, the resulting middle game with an isolated pawn on d4 is perfectly playable for white. If black avoids this, black will usually transpose to a main line of 3 knight f3 variation. For example, let's choose e3, knight f6, bishop takes c4, e6, knight f3. So let's look at 3 e4. For a very long time, this very natural reaction to d takes c4 suffered the same fate as e3 and knight c3. It was thought to be inaccurate because of 3 e5. The difference is that in this case, white has the promising pawn sacrifice for knight to f3. E takes d4, bishop takes c4 exclamation point, when his development is swift and aggressive, and black will have to take great care in getting his king into safety. This is in fact a lively variation with chances for both sides. Just one example of a critical line. Knight takes c6, castle, bishop e6, and now bishop takes e6, f takes e6, bishop b3, bishop d7, bishop takes b7, wins back the pawn, but the remaining position is hard to judge. Black has secured his strong pawn on d4 and is catching up in development fast. Another standard device for counterattacking against the white center consists of the 3 c5. Take a look at that. The d pawn is drawn forward. White has, of course, the very quiet knight f3. C takes d4, queen takes d4. But 4 d5 is the principal reaction, when the natural follow-up is 4 knight to f6, knight c3, and now e6, attacking the white pawn on d5. The position that then arises after bishop takes c4, e takes d5, knight takes d5, knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, bishop e7, knight f3, castle, castle, has turned out to be quite reasonable for black if he attacks white's strong bishop on d5 without delay. This has to be done with knight to a6, followed by knight to c7. In some cases, 12 bishop to e6 But anyways, knight c7, and also with 10, queen to b6, and bishop e6. Now sharper, though not necessarily better, is 6 bishop f3, intending to meet the e takes d5 with e5. I shall discuss this position when we look at the variations of knight f3 and of the knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, c5 below. In the meantime, b5 instead of e6 is an alternative. This is far more speculative and has not yet been analyzed very thoroughly. Black does not have to worry about knight takes b5, queen a5 check, knight c3, knight takes e4, nor does e5, b4 pose a serious threat. But a dangerous move seems to be 6 bishop f4. Another way of drawing the enemy forward is 3 knight to f6, when e5. Now knight c3 makes e5 even more attractive than on the previous move. So 4 e5, knight d5, bishop c4 offers white more space, but black will have a solid position and a very useful square on d5 for his pieces. This variation has become very popular of late, with attention focusing mainly on knight to b6, bishop b3, knight c6, knight e2, bishop f5, castle kingside, e6, knight on b to c3. More provocative still is knight to c6, because this move blocks the pawn on c7 that would normally want to rush forward in this opening, at least in a classical interpretation of it. It comes at no surprise, therefore, that the playability of this variation largely depends on accurate calculations. Black has to know what he is doing, but if he does, this is a tricky variation also for white. Black intends to meet d5 with knight to e4, and also meets knight f3 with bishop g4. The main line goes bishop e3, knight f6, knight c3, e5. When after d5, black has tried both the fairly solid knight to e7, which is bishop takes c4, knight to g6, and the more bellicose knight to a5. All right, so let's look at knight f3. Throughout the history of the Queen's Gambit accepted, this has been white's most popular move in this position. White does not hurry to win back the pawn that he has sacrificed. He calmly develops his pieces and offers his opponent as few targets for an immediate counterattack as possible. Knight f6. Alternatives to this natural move are mostly subtle attempts either to lure white into one of the variations discussed below or to avoid one of them. 3a6, for instance, intends to steer clear of the sharp knight f6, knight c3 lines, hoping to transpose to the much quieter knight f6, e3 variation. After 4e3, knight f6, bishop takes c4, e6, castle kingside, and c5. The point of a6 is to meet the straightforward e4 with 4b5. When the standard reply, a4 is not as powerful as white would like it to be, because black has bishop b7 attacking the pawn on e4. On knight to c3, black also has b4, when a4 can be met with b4. The same logic applies to 3e6. Black wants to meet e4 with b5, a4, bishop b7, or c6. A takes b5, c takes b5, b3, bishop b7, when things are rather unclear. Here too, 4e3 will normally transpose to a 3 knight f6 e3 variation. Theory of both of those moves is still in the experimental stages. c6 again is very similar. This move was discussed in the chapter on the Slav and semi-Slav. Here too, black tries to, quote, do something with his pawn on c4 rather than follow the classical recipe of just giving it away and developing his pieces instead. The most straightforward defense of c4 of all, 3b5, is not to be recommended, however. In fact, this move will give white the ideal opportunity to start an attack on all fronts by a4, c6, a takes b5, c takes b5, b3, c takes b3, and e4. Now 3c5, a move that we've already seen as a possible reply to 3e4, is based on a completely different idea. Black attacks the white center straight away. The most principled reply, d5, is met by e6. And what makes this variation particularly interesting is that the quiet e3 allows c takes d4, e takes d4, bishop e6, making it a little more difficult for white to get his pawn back. We now return to black 3, knight f6. Now there are two main lines. The sharper is knight to c3, intending to continue e4, and then the older, more popular is e3. Now a third option, bishop a4 check, which is certainly not bad, but does not pose black as many problems as the two main lines. A solid reply is c6, queen takes d4, bishop f5, giving the game a distinctly Slav flavor. On the 3, knight f3, knight f6, and then 4, knight c3 line, this aggressive move has caused many a devotee of the Queen's Gambit accepted, including, I am sorry to have to admit, myself, some sleepless nights, especially in the 1970s, when theory recommended 4a6. It is precisely this move which involves great risk for black if white continues unflinchingly e4, b5, e5, knight to d5, a4. Although this position may look attractive for black, white's attacking chances are in fact very dangerous, particularly if white is a player with a natural flair for the initiative who is not afraid of sacrificing some material. One example of what black is in for in this line is provided by the variation c6, a takes b5, knight takes c3, b takes c3, c takes b5, knight to g5 exclamation point, f6, queen f3, rook a7, e6 exclamation point. Although it is actually highly unclear how this position should be evaluated, it is clear that having one's king side squashed is not to everyone's taste. Yeah, I agree. The most obvious defense runs 7, knight takes c3, and then b takes c3. Now the natural 8, bishop b7 is also not safe. Once again, 4, 9, e6 exclamation point gives white a very dangerous attack. During the 1980s, it was established that 8 queen to d5 is more solid, yet here too white turns out to have sufficient compensation for the pawn if he calmly plays 9 g3, bishop b7, bishop g2, bishop d7, bishop a3. Black is under pressure, though it is only fair to add that he is not without chances either. A gambit will always be a double-edged sword. It was not until the very last years of the 20th century that a truly solid defense against this variation was unearthed at last. Much to everyone's surprise, it turned out that 7 e6, a takes b5, and now far from obvious knight to b6 really takes the sting out of white's attacking plans. The game takes on a positional character and the chances are more or less equal. While this heavy theoretical battle raged through the 4a6 line, the alternative 4c5 was also explored in great depth. At first, this move seemed unattractive because of the violent attack 5d5, e6, e4, e takes d5, and e5 exclamation point. But some staunch supporters of the black cause managed to establish a solid defense following 7 knight on f to d7. To begin with, it was discovered that after 8 queen takes d5, the surprisingly knight to b6 is perfectly satisfactory for black, and even the loss of tempo involved in 8 bishop g5 bishop e7, bishop takes, queen takes, knight takes d5, queen d8. Turns out not to have any damaging effect on the black position, provided he dislodges the knight on d5 as soon as possible. In fact, the variation bishop takes c4, knight takes c6, castle kingside, and knight to b6 exclamation point is considered about equal. Black also has two fully acceptable transpositional moves at his disposal. 4e6 produces a variation of the Queen's Gambit declined. So for example, d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, knight f6, knight f3, d takes c4. While after 4 c6, we suddenly find ourselves in Slav accepted. All right, let's take a look at the 3 knight f3, knight f6, 4 e3 line for white. This has always been the most popular way of meeting the Queen's Gambit accepted. White wins back his pawn and calmly develops his kingside before taking any further action. e6. Black also develops unhurriedly. The attempt to hang on to the pawn on c4 by b5 is ill-fated. White immediately demolishes the black pawn flanks with a4, c6, a takes b5, c takes b5, b3, and gets the upper hand. Bishop g4 is more interesting. This active move poses white some concrete problems, and it is not easy to refute. In the early days, it was thought that white could just win a pawn by 5, bishop c4, e6, and queen to b3. Until it was demonstrated that black gets an excellent game if he replies bishop takes f3, g takes f3, knight on b d7, queen takes b7, and then c5. White has an extra pawn, but is lagging behind in development. A more careful approach, so after bishop takes c4 and then e6, is white plays 6 knight to c3, knight on b to d7, h3, bishop h5, castle kingside, bishop d6, e4. But now the true point behind bishop g4 is revealed. Black will play e5 and hold his ground in the center. This makes that 4 bishop g4 move a very lively variation with considerably less theoretical baggage to carry than 4 e6. All right, 5 bishop takes c4, c5, white castles. This is white's most natural move, but he has an interesting and very subtle alternative in 6 queen to e2. Unafraid of the isolated queen's pawn that will result from an exchange on d4, he intends to take on c5 if black continues 6a6, parallel to the main line. The difference is that in this case, d takes c5 will not allow an exchange of queens, and this makes it the position after bishop takes c5, castle kingside, much more dynamic than in the parallel version, castle kingside, a6, d takes c5, which is discussed below. Remarkably enough, perhaps, this position is full of danger for black because it is precisely in an open position with a symmetrical pawn structure that a slight lead in development will be felt the most acutely, and that is precisely the advantage that white has here. The possibility of an advance in the center, e4 to e5, has to be carefully monitored. One of the many ways that theory has suggested of doing this is black knight c6, e4, b5. Not e5, double question mark, immediately because of bishop takes f7 check, king takes f7, and then queen to c4 check. So after b5, bishop b3, and then e5. We now return to 6, where white castles. Here, black is faced with a far-reaching choice. The most obvious and also the simplest strategy is to take on d4 and play against the resulting isolated d-pawn. This may be done either at once, by playing c takes d4, or in a slightly more subtle way, by knight c6, waiting for 7 queen to e2 before taking on d4, c takes d4, rook d1, bishop e7, e takes d4, black castles. If white then continues 10 knight to c3, which is the obvious move, Then 10, knight to a5. 11, bishop d3, b6, followed by bishop b7, is a standard maneuver for increasing control over d5. This is a sound way of playing. In theory, could end here, but unfortunately, perhaps opening theory is never satisfied. It always looks further. It always wants to find something which is even better, even more accurate, or even more difficult to handle for the opponent. That is why another move has become the uncontested main line in this position, 6a6. Black waits for a more favorable opportunity to take on d4 and introduces the possibility of developing his queenside swiftly and comfortably with b5, followed by bishop to b7 and knight on b to d7. White has tried several ways of combating this scheme. To begin with, 7 queen to e2 is important. White simply allows his opponent to carry out his plan and concentrates on his own chances. He wants to gain space in the center with rook d1 and e4. So after 7 b5, bishop b3, bishop b7, rook d1, knight on b to d7, knight c3, we arrive at a crucial position. Black now has to consider not only the e4 advance, but d5 as well. These are dangerous plans, but by now theory has worked them out pretty thoroughly, and it seems Black will be able to cope with these threats. The most popular move nowadays is 10, queen to b6. Another idea altogether is to play 7 a4, preventing Black's plan in a radical way at the cost of a slight weakening of the queen side. White abandons control over b4, a square which Black can now use for his knights or his king's bishop, especially if he now switches to the old plan of playing against the isolated queen's pawn. So 7, knight c6, queen e2, c takes, d4, rook d1, bishop e7, e takes d4, castling, kingside, and knight c3. This position is crucial for an evaluation of 7a4. But as in so many similar cases, here too the question of whether you want to play with or against the isolated queen's pawn is largely a matter of taste. It all boils down to weighing dynamic features against static ones, which is a difficult but also a very personal matter. Opening theory, of course, does not take a personal view of the matter and just tries to look at all the possibilities as accurately as possible. In this case, a verdict has yet been reached despite decades of practical experience. Black's position is solid and he has good long-term prospects. But for the time being, White has the freer piece play and holds the initiative. A much more flexible strategy that was popular during the 1990s is to anticipate b5 by retreating the bishop straight away, so as to be able to respond to b5 with immediate a4, hoping to take over the initiative on the queen side. For this purpose, both 7 b3, bishop to b3, and 7 bishop to d3 have been played. Black's standard reaction to this plan is to switch to the strategy of playing against the isolated queen's pawn. So the c takes d4 plan. But there are a few interesting alternatives. So for example, 7 against bishop b3, Black might consider b5 anyway, while against bishop d3, the subtle knight on b to d7, sometimes followed by b6, is an option. A very radical solution to the problems of this opening is to play 7 d takes c5. Although this simplifies the position and looks totally harmless at first sight, world champions Boris Spassky and Vladimir Kramnik have successfully used this idea. After 7 queen takes d1, rook takes d1, and bishop takes c5, White still has that minimal lead in development, which a great champion may be able to use to his advantage even in the endgame. Finally, White's sharpest move in this position is undoubtedly 7e4. Yet, strangely enough, this is not particularly dangerous for Black. White's idea is if Black takes on e4, so for example, 7 knight takes e4, then White can play 8 d5. Although it is far from clear if this poses any problems, if Black simply continues bishop e7, most players prefer b5, and then bishop d3, and then bishop b7, which has proved to be very reliable.